Oh boy, this is going to be an episode that might get the weirdos crawling out of whatever holes they're hiding in. Throughout the 20th and 21st century, regardless of all the fights and squabbles we might get into, humanity has been able to agree on one thing. Fascists are bad. However, who and what they are have been a question since the last time we killed a lot of them. And nowadays, it's starting to look like people even like them. But why is that? What are fascists really? And why am I so violently hateful of them? All this and more on this episode of Why Aren't You Talking About This? Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of WAYTAT. I'm your host, William, and I will probably be getting put on a list or question for this episode. Maybe. I'm gonna say some kind of dark things about people towards the end. I mean, people that deserve it, sure, but the U.S. government tends to only be okay with violent rhetoric when it's against people that don't deserve it. Anyways, before I stack the jury even more, I want to thank you so much for listening. It means the world to me that my voice is colliding with your lizard brain harder than, well, I'm sure you can finish the rest of that. Let's just say it's something incredibly violent towards a fascist. Alright, so as far as updates go, we still don't really have any. I mean, besides a fanboy on Twitter asked how I was doing because I hadn't posted on Twitter in a while, so, quite the confidence boost. Um, Also, someone downloaded every fucking episode a few days ago, and I've had like 100 listeners in 90 days, which might not sound like much, but for a dude not doing any ads and producing dubiously reliable and quality content, that's pretty fucking good. Although also podcast stats tend to be pretty inconsistent and meh, so. But anyways, make sure to keep sharing and bothering your friends, family, and strangers about the show to get the word out and keep things growing. Like my peen. Also, yes, my break is in a few episodes. I'm gonna plan to do 3 months off, but most of that is gonna be working on episodes at like a slow pace, just so I can put something out as soon as I come back. Having two shows and a job is rough, but if you don't want that anymore and you want me to just do these shows, sending this to other people is going to help a lot with that. Um, but also, let me know what kind of things you guys want to see to improve the show, and also just like other things that you want me to do. I'm not necessarily open to like a massive increase in workload. I already am putting out episodes late enough. But just, like, I don't know, like, I know a bunch of nerd shit. I have a lot of opinions on a lot of different things. Just, whatever. But yeah, you can send me emails or DM me on Twitter or, however else you can get a hold of me. But anyways, on to the show. Alright, kids, if you like violence, then get ready to watch me stick things in people's eyelids. We're talking about fascists and fascism today. So before we really get into my rage and why I feel it, let's talk about what fascism even is in the first place. So it's a political movement that emphasizes extreme nationalism, i.e. loyalty to the state, militarism, and supremacy of a nation over people living in that nation. And supremacy of the nation over the people living in that nation. In direct contrast to democracy and liberalism. But if you're a fucking idiot or a goddamn asshole, you might be wondering what's so wrong with that. Well, let me tell you. Fascists generally advocate for overthrowing the current regime, usually through extreme violence, including vilifying the current form of government and probably literally killing their political enemies, as well as turning them into monsters in the minds of their followers. Fascists champion traditional values and are deeply conservative, and while they claim to represent the everyman, they're actually more in league with corrupt politicians and corporations. So basically, there's something here to hate for everyone. However, this doesn't fully explain fascism. For that, you need to break it down into some characteristics. Cultural characteristics of fascism would include censorship, indoctrination, and secret police. Social ones would be a focus on the middle class and trying to appeal to them, industrialism, and the military. Basically, the three things that they want society built on. Their principles are authoritarianism, state over people, action over thought, and charismatic leaders. Their politics are always nationalist, racist, and under one party that's under a supreme leader, and their economy is controlled by either the state or by state-run corporations. On top of this, fascist leaders usually have their own hallmarks and characteristics. They're generally extreme nationalists, believe in the superiority of a single group based on race, religion, ethnicity, or nationality, or sometimes all the above. And also a big part of this is blaming all the nation's problems on a particular group deemed inferior. Remember that tickle in the back of your brain. Second, they develop a cult of personality, which portrays them and their fellow fascist leaders as legendary figures and heroes to be loved and admired, largely through mass media and propaganda. Again, that tickle in your brain. And third, they advocate for popular mobilization. See, they hate democracy and dissenters, much like authoritarians, but unlike them, they don't want people to be placated and calm or too scared to do anything. No, they want them to be energized and pissed. They want them to participate in government-sanctioned events, government work, war, and killing of dissenters. So, hopefully you can see why it's dangerous. Fascism is basically a system of government where there is a small, morally bankrupt, corrupt, and violent group of people in charge of a massive, violent, industrial, and militaristic middle class that doesn't take no for an answer and will kill you if you step out of line. Fascism teaches that everyone not in the group is the enemy and must be hunted and killed. So then, if this is the end game, if this is the end game, how is it that fascism gets roots? When basically every government ever see this and go, oh fuck no, not in my house? And when most of the poor and upper class see this and go, oh goddamn holy fucking shit, why are there Nazis everywhere? Well, yes, if they're dumb about it, but fascists are sneakier than that. They claim power in 5 stages. Stage 1 is to emerge from disillusionment. When social turmoil and economic downturn occurs, fascists crawl out like maggots or tapeworms to capitalize on the disillusionment, making themselves out as the solution and aiming the rage and dissatisfaction of the middle class with things that are vague and hard to conceptualize in a single perceived direction. Then step 2 occurs. With the steam they've gained and a building power base, they capitalize by either joining or forming a political party and begin to establish themselves as a legitimate organization with real and totally not insane members. From this, in step 3, they begin to ally with members of the right wing, from conservatives to authoritarians to racists to domestic terrorists and other right-wing affiliates. And yes, I know I just described the Republican Party, you don't have to point it out. They start to create a web of power and alliances to call upon and can begin to sway the conversation towards them being in charge by leveraging these alliances and a strong, loyal base. Then in step 4, they rise to power. As they rise to power, they dominate institutions. Give an inch, and they start electing Supreme Court justices and federal judges. They absorb right-wing groups and put loyalists in positions of power and use corruption to find the cracks in the system and anyone meant to stop them and either tear them down or take them over. And then finally, having their power secured, they implement radical reforms. With this, they've basically won and have taken control of the government. Which is fucking scary, because you probably won't notice until step 3 or 4. But luckily for us, and free, eh, but luckily for us and future generations, after the Shoah, 14 warning signs of fascism were posted in the American Holocaust Museum. I'm pretty sure these warning signs are also in other places around the world. It's not just in America. Um, so basically, if you're worried about your country becoming fascist, you can look at these warning signs to determine how worried you should be. So the first is powerful and continuous nationalism. So, okay, keep an eye out if you see a fuck ton of nationalistic talk going around. Second is disdain for human rights. Huh. Anyways, third is identification of enemies as a unifying cause. This feels familiar. When the US gets unilaterally villainized by a right-wing group. Fourth is rampant militarism. The military is celebrated over everything else, and a lot of national resources are dedicated to it. Huh, that's interesting. Fifth is rampant sexism. Women are property under fascism, and other sexualities are hated. Six is controlled mass media, where all manners of media are under the same ownership. Why does this also sound familiar? Seventh is an obsession with national security, which sounds a bit like the NSA and TSA and constant surveillance. Anyways, eighth is that government and religion are deeply intertwined. Oh, fuck. This is familiar. Alright. 9 and 10, corporate power is protected and labor power is suppressed, which, again, sounds very fucking familiar. 11th is a disdain for intellectuals. 11th is a disdain for intellectuals and the arts. 12th is an obsession with crime and punishment. 13th is rampant cronyism and corruption, and 14th is election fraud. Okay, now enough acting. If these sound familiar and activating that tickle in the back of your brain again, yes, I sense it too. How many of these feel like America? And how many of these have been Americanisms for decades that we've just kind of brushed off? But, I mean, how can that be? We fought them during World War II. We hate fascists. Well, let's talk about how fascists draw people in then to, really understand. Basically, it appeals to young and violent men because fascism glorifies violence and tells them that their feelings of alienation and insecurity aren't their fault. Basically, the reason why they can't get pussy isn't because there's difficult questions they need to start asking about their own behavior, appearance, and attitude, as instead because modern women are evil and also immigrants. That the people who find fascism support a traditionally masculine culture with the right to extract violence with a hatred for progress and progressive ideas, largely because they either feel excluded or have been excluded, and feel entitled to controlling the nation, which is similar to the incarnation of fascism in the 30s and 40s. Fascism feeds from culture wars and eats into your resentment and insecurities to brainwash you into thinking that everyone is at fault but you, and that you deserve to take violent vengeance on them. Assuming it's the enemies of the state, of course, which most of the time, if they're trying to appeal to you, you are going to target enemies of the state. It's also aesthetically pleasing because it's meant to be. Fascists are trying to play you onto their side so they can use you to gain power. So if that means appealing to your love of cool uniforms, pretty women, and badass animals, they'll do it. Which, again, both the Nazis and the Italian fascists did that. That's why, people say, well, I mean, their uniforms are cool, because they were designed to be. They were designed by professional designers. That's also why a lot of, old fascist propaganda have, very attractive women in it. It's because they're trying to tell you, oh yeah, all the hot women are fascists now. Okay, but, I mean, now you're gonna start seeing it everywhere. See, fascism is also attractive because of how it's presented. The idea is that the leader, the nation, and the people are all one thing. So when one thrives, the others do. Hence the bundle of sticks narratives. That's actually something that's been pointed out, is said in Star Trek a lot, which is kind of funny. But the bundle of sticks narratives is that one stick is easy to break, but a bundle of them is impossible. Fascists will use that as a rallying point. See, they'll also point at democracy, a society made up of the collective will of individuals, and call it wrong because it doesn't represent you, the real people. What would represent you is if everyone shared the same attitudes, beliefs, desires, religion, language, ethnicity, etc., and formed a single super individual. So you're not competing, but you're working together. But, I mean, who are the people? Well, according to the fascists, it's anyone with the correct attributes. Yeah, so people who promote things like great replacement theory, hate immigration, and tell you to spread your seed by any means possible and think abortion should be illegal? Yeah, probably have some fascist leanings. But there's some signs to look for to know for sure, so that you're not just randomly pointing the finger at people that you don't like. Firstly, fascists nearly fetishize tradition and traditional values and prefer traditional ways of thinking over more modern ideas. Speaking of which, secondly, they reject modernism and progress. The modern world is wrong and evil, and progress is just as bad. Third is action for its own sake, without reflection. Do something before you can consider the consequences, thinking about the impact of your actions and who they'll harm is pussy shit. See, me telling you that I want to shoot a fascist isn't me ironically being fascist, because I've thought it through and understand the impact and don't care. In fact, sometimes it makes me smile. Fourth, disagreement is treason. Fifth, fascists fear and hate differences in diverse groups of people. That's actually one the fascists will try to use to convince you that you're the fascist, but just understand, you're not the fucking fascist if the people saying that you hate diversity are all bald white dudes wearing the same uniform and like you're standing next to like a whole bunch of different varieties of queer and brown people. They are the ones who are not diverse. Sixth, they try to appeal to frustration and especially to the middle class. Especially if that middle class feels humiliated, hopeless, frightened, and in crisis. Because the one thing the middle class hates more than anything is the thought of being poor. Seventh, they obsess with people plotting against them. Eighth, the enemy is both weak and strong. They're weak enough to be beaten, but too powerful to be defeated. Yeah, that one doesn't make sense on purpose. They're leading you on by telling you that killing all those goddamn immigrants are right on the horizon if only you support them, but also they need you to give them more power because the immigrants that come here with nothing are more powerful than what the laws of physics normally allows. Ninth, pacifism or peace are working with their enemies. 10th is a contempt for the weak, powerless, and disabled. 11th is that everyone who bends the knee is told they're a hero and that dying for the state is the greatest heroism you can achieve. 12th, they love their guns, hate women and gays, and want you to see them as a powerful, dominant, well-armed alpha male that's breeding your girlfriend. Mind, they probably look like your average 4chan user. 13th is selective, and they also probably have not ever fired a gun. 13th is selective populism, where they cherry pick people that agree with them and hold them up as the voice of all people. And finally, they use simple vocabulary at elementary school levels, telling you that's the only way to talk in order to limit your critical thinking. Basically, they introduce, like, quote-unquote, new ways of speaking, where they reinvent simple words to mean very fascist ideas, and they teach their followers that, like, oh no, this is the only way to speak to, like, really get it. And so it limits your critical thinking, because if you're willing to go with them on that, then you have more limited vocabulary to be able to, like, question their shit. But with all that covered, let's talk about the history. Alright, so the beginnings of fascism is kind of hard to pin down exactly, because you could argue that the structure from the ancient Spartans under King Lycurgus, being a militaristic city-state focused on service and racial purity, might have been the beginnings. But the actual term that mutate into fascist comes from the ancient Roman fasces, a symbol of office for lictors, which was an axe in the middle of a bundle of sticks they'd sometimes use on rioters or political dissidents. Since, they were bodyguards to magisters and also their uh, their their attendance. However, some fascists, like Jorge Valos, the first French fascist, claimed it was from the popularist and totalitarian Jacobean movement, or that maybe it came from post French Revolution mass ideological and religious values. Not helping is that the fascists became a symbol of the strength of unity around the same time, meaning a ton of governments as well as fascists took up the symbol. Others point to the role of Napoleon III, who was well known for censorship and secret police in the mid 1800s, or the 1871 Risorgimento in Italy. Also, there's going to be a lot of Italian, French, German words in this timeline. Just be prepared for that. And another possible origin is that is the 1880s fin de siècle movement, which is an ideology based on the closing of an era. In this case, a revolt against materialism, rationalism, positivism, the bourgeoisie, and democracy, and instead is focused on emotionalism, irrationalism, subjectivism, and vitalism. Vitalism being life, like living life, which is not as positive as it sounds. It's basically like, yes, all the terrible things that are happening right now is a good thing. They also saw civilization as being in crisis and needing some massive solutions to the issues that they saw, and they consider the individual as a single cell of larger collective. Yeah. They were largely influenced by people like Darwin, de Gobineau, Le Bon, Nietzsche, I know how to pronounce this, Dostoevsky, and Bergson. So regardless, fascism has a lot of possible influences, but all of them kind of circle the same shit drain. So when did we actually start seeing something we describe as fascism? Well, beginning in the late 19th century with Charles Maurras, who coined the idea of integral nationalism, which called for the unity of a nation through a single powerful monarch. He also hated democracy. And in 1908, Jorge Sorel, another fucking Jorge, in his book Reflections on Violence, promotes political violence and syndicalism, which is more chilled out form of communism, where basically all the workers join together in a single union and then fucking crash the country into a brick wall until the revolution is achieved. It's chilled out compared to Stalinist or Leninist communism, where part of it is that no, you violently rise up and kill everyone that disagrees with you. But then in 1909, Sorel leaves the left and goes alt-right, which tells me that the acute socialist goth girl said no to his request to all 19 types of jobs, and none of them have to do with employment. Supporting my theory is that it was a militant Catholic pro-French organization that saw anti-democracy right-wing Christians as the true patriots. So yeah, she probably told him that she's lesbian. But he started to support Charles Maurras's ideas, eventually leading to Enrico Corradini in Italy speaking out against democracy and that society should be run by elite aristocrats. And the final major influence would be the Manifesto Futurism, which championed action and political violence. And in 1910, just in time for World War I, the Italian Nationalist Association is founded. They had ties amongst Catholics, conservatives, and business people. They believed in the rejection of bourgeoisie values, democracy, liberalism, Marxism, internationalism, and pacifism, while promoting heroism, vitalism, and violence. This is because of their strongest survive philosophy and a belief that democracy was incompatible with the modern world. From 1914 to 1918, as societies become more brutalistic in style and also more violent, given the, massive fucking world-shaking war, fascism may have finally had enough heat to start. Others say that it might have started with Bismarck, as there's like a direct line between Bismarck and Hitler of like influence. Regardless, the Italian political left becomes split over the war, with the Socialist Party being opposed by many syndicalists supporting it, seeing war as the only way to ensure that socialism and communism succeeds. You know, just average leftist activities, interfighting while the alt-right rises. In 1914, Angelo Oliverio Ovoletti, I don't feel bad about mispronouncing any of these names, they're all fucking fascists, fuck them, found the Revolutionary Fasces of International Action, with Mussolini joining. That name should be very familiar. Similar movements were occurring in Germany at the time, with the National Socialism movement, described by Johanna Flensch, with rejection of democracy, human rights, individualism, and liberalism, in favor of duty, discipline, law and order, and racial solidarity. The racial comrades would unite to create a socialist society against Britain. Which, if you weren't if you were interested in knowing what those words are in German, it would be National Sozialistik, or Nazi. So, you know, clearly bad things are starting to happen. In 1915, members of the RFIA movement start calling themselves fascist, and Mussolini hosts their first and only meeting, declaring that Europe needs to solve its quote-unquote national problems, which probably included Catholics and Jews. And this was not because they fell apart, it was because the government and socialists were trying to stamp them out, while also infighting. 2 years later, the October Revolution influences fascism, and being fascinated, Leon Trotsky begins to study it. Man, hopefully he's able to finish that research and come to some very important conclusions about fascists. Also, just quick sidebar, this is why leftists like me are so fucking frustrated that all we do is infight. Can we just fucking focus for 5 seconds? Like, we have bigger issues than which variety of Marxism is correct. There's people that want both of us dead and think we're just no good commies. Okay? Just fucking focus. 5 seconds, focus on the fucking fascists. Anyways, unsurprisingly, the fascists very quickly turn against communism, seeing them as just as much the enemy as democracy. In 1918, at the end of the war, fascists began seeing it as the needed push for the revolution, with this being the beginning of the state's power to mobilize their nation to war, of mass politics and technology, and that humans would always fit into their view of the world, and that progress was a lie. That's great. This inspired the 1919 writing of the Manifesto of the Italian Fascists of Combat by Alceste de Ambris and Filippo Tommaso Marinetti. Fuck these guys. Which consolidated the concepts and platforms fascists would use. And using populist topics, fascism grows in Italy. Until one day, in 1920, they strike. Gabriele de Annunzio raids the Croatian city of Rijeka, and the city is renamed Fiume and becomes its own state, with the charter being written by de Annunzio and de Ambris, which was seen by fascists as the ideal constitution of what would become fascist Italy. Also in Italy, with a rise of militant actions from industrialized workers, fascists sided with businesses and began to help suppress leftists. Again, which is why we need some fucking solidarity. This solidified a growing alliance between conservatives and fascists, and this allows them to explode in numbers and influence. Throughout the 20s, the fascists support aggressive foreign policy and corporatism, and by 1922, the black shirts under Mussolini take over parts of Italy, and fearing the fall of Rome, King Victor Emmanuel makes Mussolini prime minister. At the same time, fascists are starting to violently occupy cities and towns and attack socialists openly. And being influenced by their neighbors, the Germans adopt the same policies as Italy, resulting in the failed Beer Hall Putsch, their first and failed attempted coup. Basically, the Nazis marched on the Fettenhall and were met with a police barricade, and in the resulting fight, 5 innocent people died. Did also make the government aware of Hitler and killed 15 Nazis, so there's a little bit of silver lining. Back in Italy, the Acerbo laws passed, which granted fascists the majority of seats in the parliament. At the same time, Giacomo... I feel bad about this one, because this guy's not a fascist. At the same time, Giacomo Matteotti, which is a prominent leftist, was kidnapped and murdered. And as the leftists walked out of Parliament in protest, Mussolini took responsibility of it, but denied any wrongdoing, which is, kind of a red flag. 2 years later, to draw on the traditionalist crowd, abortion and birth control became crimes against the state. In 1929, and probably the top 10 worst moves ever done by the Catholic Church, somewhere between kid diddling and that time that they blamed the Jews for taking Jesus from them, the Catholics give their blessings to the fascists. I mean, this is reversed within 2 years as they realized what the fuck they did, but the damage was already done. The people flocked to Mussolini. You gotta keep in mind, Italy has always been heavily Catholic. Just in time for the Great Depression. Which causes an eruption of fascism worldwide, in particular in the Nazi Party, which becomes the first full-on fascist government to take control in 1933. But also notable would be Hungary, Romania, Brazil, Poland, Netherlands, Greece, France, and Lithuania. In the late 30s, Mussolini becomes more vocal about his hatred of Catholics and deposing the Pope and the Nazis and the Nazis say similar, banning church activities, documents, and sending priests to concentration camps. Then, with the Nazi invasion of France and Poland, the war between fascism and democracy begins. A war that would destroy millions of lives and cause untold destruction. And we're not going to go really at all into this because World War II is a massive fucking topic and there's so many things to talk about with it that we'd never finish this. But just remember that Hitler knows what a Luger tastes like when it's fired, and Mussolini got hung upside down from a clothesline and beat to death, both of which were very deserved. But with the end of the war and the Nuremberg trials, several Nazi leaders were imprisoned or executed, while other Nazis were snatched up by the Russians and Americans. However, many of the fascist regimes and movements in Europe dissolved, which is not the case for other nations. Spain, one of the few fascist nations that survived, remained fascist until 1975. At least one of the few surviving European fascist nations. The other one, Portugal, the Portuguese Estado Novo, which is now considered a para-fascist nation, began in the 30s and 40s. Argentina was also fascist and housed war criminals after World War II under Juan Perón. Although it's kind of debated whether or not it's actually fascist or just almost fascist. Almost immediately, the US aligned with Italian fascists in the National Alliance movement to fight socialism and communism, because, that's a good idea, and they're still around, merging with the People of Freedom in 2008, and then split into the Brothers of Italy in 2012, which includes some of Mussolini's still fucking fascist living descendants. And fascism is still around today in many countries in the world, with a lot of fascist pockets all over the place. Also, as an aside, I'm not going to say their name because then they could probably trace me down. But if you find his living descendants on Twitter, if you just post a picture of them or Mussolini or anyone upside down, they'll freak the fuck out on you because they know that means being hung upside down and beaten to death. Yeah, it's actually kind of kind of a meme on Italian Twitter where if you really want to piss off a fascist, just post a picture of anyone upside down and they immediately know that you're talking about beating them to death. Anyways, with that, we're going to go over to the American timeline. So in the 18th century, and also 1914, before being associated with fascism, the fascists are added to the Capitol building, and then the Lincoln Monument, under their original meaning of strength from unity. So let me tell you, nowadays that's not a good look. In the 20s, we started seeing fascists pop up, with the first in the US probably being Marcus Garvey, the leader of the UNIA, who were black nationalists. And from those origins, fascists started to pop up all over the US. And despite how scary this was, very few Americans really took it seriously, including taking Mussolini himself seriously, with even in media his brand of fascism being depicted as pathetic, which you can see in a lot of like propaganda cartoons. Hitler was always seen as like the big main threat, and then it was like, oh yeah, Mussolini's here too. That is until the Nazis rose to power, because almost immediately Hitler's witch hunts, book burnings, violence in the streets, and hateful rhetoric was starting to set off some red flags. His actual acts of evil made fascism scary to Americans rather than silly like Mussolini's was. And now this isn't to say that Mussolini wasn't evil. It's because Mussolini's evil was more easy for Americans to understand. I mind that most of the people alive at this time had parents that had owned human beings or had been involved in the Civil War. So America's understanding of evil was like, oh yeah, Mussolini's evil is like silly and goofy because we did that a few decades ago. While Hitler's was like, oh shit, that's bad. In 1934, American fascists start coming to a head around this date as the ACLU creates a pamphlet warning of fascist groups under different shirt colors, which is the thing. A lot of fascists will have like a particular shirt color that they wear, and they all wear that shirt color. Mussolini's was the black shirts, as I said earlier, but there were like gold shirts, red shirts, blue shirts, white shirts, and stuff like in the US. But we likely would have continued to become more and more fascist, since we called Hitler Man of the Year one time in Time magazine, and a ton of US rich folk liked the ideas that were being spouted, alongside the middle class, because, oh man, does America hate immigrants? That is, until World War II. Because during the war, despite many corporations and business people lying in bed with the Nazis and other fascists, America mobilized. Albeit, it wasn't because we hated the Nazis or other fascists. The US feared fascism, yes, but the sentiments weren't uncommon in the US at the time. And a combination of not knowing the full extent of the Shoah and not caring meant that the US did nothing until the public began to bray for blood, both in Europe and Japan. Which they had been until the attack on Pearl Harbor, when American citizens demanded war. Like, openly and, like, aggressively. And so we declared war on Japan, which triggered a war with the Nazis. And all throughout the war, we propagandized to a generation that the Nazis were dangerous and evil, and all they stood for was to be fought against and killed. A lesson that they seem to have forgotten. After the war and into the 50s and 60s, due to fascists and the communists being the villains of America, Americans still had a firm understanding of fascism and started to change for the better because of it. With far-right racist militarism, with a lot of anti-Semitism being linked to the enemy, America began to experience some moral growth. Now note, some, not much. However, this hatred and also the use of the term totalitarianism to describe both fascism and communism started to confuse what traits belong to which, and kind of confuse them in the minds of many Americans. Meaning fascist begins to be mixed up to mean both left and right totalitarians, which is a confusion that the fascists like. In the 60s and 70s, fascism made a comeback. With the opposition to the Vietnam War, the term totalitarian came back into popular parlance to describe the politicians in favor of the war. Fascism, in this case, being referred to them. Around the same time, the US began to ally with and pardon fascists to aid in the fight against communism. Something that was extremely uncomfortable given the commies were our allies and the fascists were our enemies not that long ago. But this further poisoned the well and made people question how bad fascism could really be. Making it all the worse and more unclear is the fall of communism in the 80s and 90s. Because now, fascists had become associated with leftists. So calling people fascists became a popular move from conservative to their left-leaning opponents. And then eventually, fascism just became a negative word used fascism became a negative word used from one political identity to another. And unfortunately, from there's not really a lot concrete I can say, given that as far as anyone cares or knows, fascism is apparently too hard to measure and until like you measure its rise after the fact. So instead, we're going to go to the current day. All right. Objectively, cutting all the shit, is fascism on the rise? Maybe? See, the thing is that it's hard for me to say because I think it is. However, in the U.S. and other industrialized nations, the number of far-right groups has been growing as we become more and more progressive. Essentially, people to the right that feel like they're no longer being heard are joining these groups or falling into the trap of fascism because they feel hopeless and alienated. Now, am I going to say that they deserve us reaching out and telling them that it's okay and that they still deserve to feel the way they do? No. This is literally their problem. If they don't want to go to therapy or think about why what they believe is becoming right-wing, then it's kind of their fault. And if you're on the right and you've somehow made it this far, I mean, holy shit, I have no idea how, this is your wake-up call. I'm not telling you to go woke. I'm telling you to actually investigate why you believe what you believe. Because most likely you're going to realize it's probably not because it's right. Anyways, across the world, a lot of these warning signs we talk about have been being blown past. I mean, think, we went through the warning signs, and how many of them have you seen in the US in major places and outlets? How many people tripping those fascist warning signs have you seen? But, I will say, on the other hand, we way overuse the term. Because fascist is used whenever anyone suggests the government do anything. From mandatory vaccinations, social service programs, supporting church programs, and closing Planned Parenthoods. These things aren't fascist in a vacuum. We all need to recognize we use fascist to mean people we disagree with who like politics. Is every crazy Facebook conspiracy theorist blaming the Jews and government for everything a fascist? No, they're just an anti-Semite and also crazy. Is the gun-toting redneck that hates women, cops, and gays a fascist? No, he's just an asshole. Is the leftist that owns a small armory and shows up to pride events strapped to protect people a fascist? No, they're just abiding to very radical leftist principles that some people need to be shot to get the hint. They also are an asshole, probably. But all these people could be foot soldiers to an actual fascist. Fascists are cunning and clever. Their leaders are charismatic and charming. And at the core, they're hateful, spiteful, and cruel, and will use you in whatever ways they can to gain power. So with that, let's go to the soapbox. Okay, so why do I hate fascists so much, you might be asking? Well, for a few reasons. One, I'm a sane person that understands when the government starts giving the rhetoric that some of the people they govern are an issue, and that you should commit violence against them, other countries, and each other for the sake of the government's wallet and control, that's a bad sign. But also because people I love and care for would be targets. My girlfriend is a queer pagan, also with a lot of tattoos. My mom is a near-radical feminist that reads books. I have a cousin with disabilities. Two of my closest friends are both queer and disabled, and one of them isn't fully white. And the other one has Irish roots, which in the US is like basically just not being white. And another one of my best friends is a tattooed Satanist leftist queer woman, and no, she's not single. And the other is a Norse pagan. And that's discounting all the people I know more loosely who'd be targets. Like some of my other friends who are friends with us, or aren't hateful against gay people. I went to college with some amazing people and excellent professors. They'd be targets too. And even on the personal moral level, fascism is entirely unacceptable on all levels. But that's also leaving something out. Me. I'm a queer leftist feminist pagan man that has a degree and styles himself both as an intellectual and outspoken against fascism. If the fascists come, do you really think I'm going to be spared? And sure, you might call me crazy for being worried about this, but let me guess. You're probably passing. In America, the fascists would probably be homophobic, sexist white men. And if you could hide yourself in plain and you could probably hide yourself in plain sight or just pretend to be on their side. At this point, I can't, nor can anyone I mentioned above. And sure, you might point out that fascism is an ideology that can't survive for very long, and you'd be right. The main issue is that successful fascism needs a constant supply of enemies, meaning when everyone who'd be obvious is purged, they almost unilaterally fall to infighting. But you're forgetting that, sure, they'd be defeated, but that means everyone I mentioned, everyone you thought of that could be targets, me, and also who knows how many people that don't fit into the narrow band of acceptable would die. Which is unacceptable. And I also don't think fascists can be rehabilitated. I know that sounds wild, but in my opinion, once you become a fascist, no matter how much deprogramming is done, you still have that mark on you. You still have the thought process and mindset that could fall to fascist ideologies. Which is why I don't care about saving fascists or arguing with them. Until they turn violent, I'll do whatever I can to stop them from being comfortable or happy with their thought process or path. I'm not trying to save them, I'm just trying to piss them off. And if they decide that the revolution is at hand, well, good luck with that. Hope we don't meet. Man, fuck fascism. Those bastards deserve the Luger and the clothesline. Anyways, if you have opinions, advice on how to make the show better, any actual fucking data on the rise of fascism in the modern world, holy shit, that is impossible to find. And really anything else you want to tell me, make sure to email me at waytatpods@gmail.com. That's WAYTATPODS@gmail.com. Remember to check out my other podcast, WAYTAT Nerd, where I do basically the same thing, but with nerd topics like fantasy, sci-fi, role-playing games, etc., where I hope you'll like the topics just as much. Also remember to follow me on Twitter at WAYTAT_pods for more episode announcements and occasionally some rants. Have a good night. Have a good night. Don't murder humans. Have fun. And remember, death to fascism, kids. This has been Why You're Talking About This, and I've been your host, William. Good night.